Hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. It's great to get to sit down with you a couple times a week and talk about some of the issues that matter. And here's one that probably isn't on a lot of people's radar screens, but it really should be, and that is legislator pay. Now, the old adage of you get what you pay for probably holds true when it comes to legislators. And yet, to compare legislative pay to other types of jobs that are more full-time jobs, it's not exactly an apples and oranges compare or apple to apple comparison. It's really apples and oranges, and it's a very part-time position. And some people say, well, maybe we should make our legislature full-time. And on the one hand, yeah, it would sure make things easier to have a professional legislature that's there doing the job 24/7 and, always on call. On the other hand, do you want more government? Do you want bigger government? Because that's how you get bigger government, is exactly that scenario. Now, better minds than mine have been tackling this issue, and it's come up a couple of times in the last few weeks. I'm going to start with an article from Fred Birnbaum from the Idaho Freedom Foundation, which this was published back at the end of October, but it talked about a reasonable path forward on Idaho lawmaker pay. Now, maybe you'll be surprised to learn what Idaho lawmakers actually make, and it's not that much. But then again, it's a part-time job. It's in session from what, January through what, about end of March, something like that. It's a matter of weeks, but they do take time off from their careers and from their farms and their families and other things that they're doing. And I don't mean to sound insensitive when I say this, but public service should actually be a bit of a sacrifice. So it shouldn't necessarily be an immense a road to immense wealth, such as we have seen happen, at the congressional level, which is just about unconscionable. Nevertheless, let's dive into Fred's report and at least get some of the background on what he is talking about here. This, again, was published at the end of October. Fred says, last week, top legislative leaders presented a plan to increase legislators' pay by up to 43%. That's a pretty good jump. This increase would give Idaho the highest paid part-time legislature in America. Also last week, several legislators circulated a survey to their colleagues asking about the pay for legislators and the amount of staff serving the legislature. Now, he says the timing was curious, to say the least. But, with the election right there, maybe it seemed like a good time to ask for a raise. I don't know. The compensation of Idaho's legislators is determined by a citizens committee that makes its recommendations to the Idaho Secretary of State and State Controller. By the way, they met yesterday, and we'll tell you more about their decision coming up here in a few minutes. As shown in their 2022 report. Now, unless there's a resolution to reject the report, it goes into effect. But if it is rejected, there's no change to the status quo. In other words, things stay just as they are. So legislative leaders appeared before the Citizens Committee to make the case. The recommendation was for a large salary increase for legislators. That failed to advance as the vote was tied. And if you go to idahofreedom.org, you can actually read Fred's report in full, which I would strongly recommend that you do. He goes into a lot of detail there that I won't have time to go into here. But here's how the suggestion shook out. By ending the per diem pay, in other words, this is what they pay for their meals on a daily basis, the 43% increase is achieved by going from a current base plus per diem of $26,425 to a salary of $37,801. So without the per diem, you're looking at roughly $19,000 something as the salary for these legislators. With the per diem, that's where you get the package compensation, which that's not, salary alone, but the package comes out to $26,425. Now, Fred says, look, that's 43%, folks. For those more than 50 miles away, the per diem has to be grossed up because it's currently not taxable income, and that would increase the effective taxable value of the $6,512 per diem to $8,630 on the high end. So this would still result in at least a 32% raise with a range of up to 38% if a member is in a low tax bracket. Now, these are a lot of numbers, and this is why, again, I'm recommending go to idahofreedom.org, look at Fred's article, and you'll see this in much, much clearer detail. I'm just hitting a few of the high points. Now, Fred points out the optics of such a large increase are terrible, and the message sent to government agencies when the topic of spending comes up, it's going to make this request rather ill-timed because look at that. State employees are going to naturally seek bigger raises if legislators lead with such a large increase. Now, I didn't include these slides, but Nicholas Kleinworth, who is an analyst for the Idaho Freedom Foundation, actually sent me a couple of slides that show what constitutionally appointed or constitutionally mandated state positions like the Attorney General, Superintendent of Public Instruction, et cetera, what they make and in terms of where their pay has increased. Oh, but that includes the governor, lieutenant governor, et cetera. And would it surprise you to know that really their pay increases have been very modest over the last few years? Now, the state budget has grown immensely, but the pay has stayed, relatively mild. It's not been a huge increase. So why this push to suddenly increase legislator pay by such a drastic amount? See, America's state legislatures, Fred reports, can be divided into three categories. You have full-time, a hybrid, which is kind of semi-full-time, and part-time. Now, Idaho is classified as having a part-time legislature by the National Conference of State Legislatures. And while the hybrid category can be somewhat arbitrary, the distinction between full and part-time is clear. So look at these 10 states with full-time legislatures. They include California, New York, Illinois, Alaska, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Now, as you're looking at that list, there's probably a few things that jump out at you like, wow, with the exception of maybe Alaska and I think with the exception of Alaska, you would think these are typically pretty blue big government states. Kind of interesting. It's an odd list, says Fred, given the size of states like Hawaii and the population of Alaska. But the highest paid legislatures are as follows. New York pays its legislators $142,000 a year. California pays $128,215 per year. That's got to be like minimum wage for the cost of living in California. That's crazy. The two lowest paid state legislatures are New Mexico, $0 a year, but they are paid a per diem, as in most states, and New Hampshire, which pays $100 a year and no per diem. Now, New Mexico definitely leans pretty blue. New Hampshire, not so sure. A lot of freedom-minded folks, but I think it's probably still quite blue given its location in New England. Now, one bit of data that does deserve comment is the number of permanent staff per legislator. Fred says, we haven't thoroughly examined the numbers, but the Legislative Service Office research suggests that Idaho is among the least staffed legislatures among the Western states. But instead of simply growing the legislative services staff, he says it might make sense to repurpose the 8 positions in the Office of Performance Evaluations to provide direct support to legislators. Legislators should have complete oversight on hiring without executive branch criteria. And finally, over the past 4 years, the state employee headcount has increased by over 1,100 full-time positions. By culling some of these positions, the legislature could make a stronger case for redirecting resources to the legislative branch. This is one of those cases where, we may have to actually choose between, okay, what do we need versus what do we want? Funny thing is, when you're doing it with taxpayer money, somehow those wants always seem to materialize, or they seem to happen. It's like magic. Next, I want to share with you some testimony that Nicholas Kleinworth shared in this meeting that took place yesterday with this committee, trying to decide, do we go ahead and increase legislator pay? Here's what Loss reports. First, he described the problem, saying this proposal would make Idaho the highest paid part-time legislature in the nation. The true increase of what was being proposed is between 32 and 43%, far above leadership's original claims. And a recent analysis shows Idaho's compensation rate is above average for a part-time legislature. And Idaho is also at par with her neighbors in Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and North Dakota. Now, he says leadership's comparison of salary with Idaho households is also flawed because he says this analysis should have considered pension eligibility, unvouchered money, state health insurance benefits. There are some real advantages to serving in the state legislature. And again, it's not the same thing as a job that you go out there and work full-time to keep, a roof over your head and food on your table. Finally, growth in legislator compensation since 2019 is ahead of other constitutional officers like the Attorney General, Lieutenant Governor, or Governor. This is 11.4% compared to 9.5% respectively. Now, a quarter of legislators started serving in 2019 or later, making this time frame more reasonable than the 20-year analysis by leadership. So there's the problems associated with this. Here are some other considerations that Loss pointed out. He said, mind you, that more pay doesn't make the legislature stronger, nor does it right-size it with the executive branch. There's no correlation between what our legislators make and the quality of their work. And as example, New York and California host the highest paid legislators in the nation, $142,000 and $128,000 respectively, yet they have the most stark declines in population among all states due to their failing policies. That's something we know a little bit about because many of the people who are fleeing those failing states like to come here to Idaho. So law says, here's our recommendation. All in all, legislator pay is already commensurate with other state employees, constitutional officers, and legislatures in other states. Therefore, the Idaho Freedom Foundation recommends an increase with a cost of living adjustment of no more than 3% of gross compensation per year. This recommendation mirrors the rate of inflation over the last year, and it's even more generous than current trends in legislator pay over the past 5 years. So in closing, he says, I urge the committee reject the leadership's irresponsible request for up to a 43% increase. Instead, I ask the committee to support a more modest increase, adjusting for the cost of living while keeping Idaho in line with her peers. Unfortunately, those recommendations apparently fell on deaf ears. As the Idaho Capital Sun reports, Idaho Citizens Committee approves legislative salary increases, albeit not as high as they had originally intended. Lawmakers who are considered part-time workers will see increase in pay unless state Senate or House reject or reduce the proposal. So this is not written in stone yet, but here's what got through the committee. Idaho lawmakers will see an increase in their pay from $19,913 to $25,000 per year for the next 2 years. The Citizens Committee on Legislative Compensation unanimously approved this exercise Wednesday morning at the Idaho State Capitol in Boise. Idaho Senate President Pro Tem and Idaho House Speaker also will receive an increase of additional $5,000 to $5,500 per year, and minority leadership will receive an increase of additional $2,000 to $2,500. So, with that in mind, it's not a done deal yet, but it looks like at least there's going to be some increase, considerably more than was proposed. But it's something you might want to get your mind around, and if you want to study it out, you will find excellent resources at the Idaho Freedom Foundation website. That's idahofreedom.org. And by the way, if we're looking for money to pay for this legislative pay increase, it's also a good time to start evaluating what is pork versus what isn't. And so in that vein, let's talk a little bit about the pork report. If you want to check that out, go to idahofreedom.org/24pork to get more information. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Press clever bias, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to